Hi everyone, and welcome to my final part of my Emil Josef Diemer documentary. In this final part we're going to be looking at some more extraordinary games that you've probably never seen, and also tell you the final part to Emil Diemer's life. In part 2 we just discussed how Diemer was declining in his performance in the 50s, and after a particularly poor performance in a tournament in England, according to his biographer, Diemer blamed his poor performance after reading a German women's magazine which argued that the reason why he played so badly was because of his biorhythm. Now, Diemer, obsessed with his new discovery, began to bombard his chess friends with different biorhythmical calculations and graphs. But this behaviour was not as strange as his newfound obsession. Diemer had discovered the 16th century French clairvoyant Nostradamus, which would end up consuming his life for the next 25 years. Before we look though into this aspect of his life, I did want to show you two great miniatures played by Diemer on the black side. So in our first game we have an anonymous player playing on the white side against Josef Diemer on the black side. And what's interesting about this particular game is his anonymous opponent decides to play the blackmar-diemer against Josef Diemer. What an honour to have someone play your own gambit against you. I'm guessing his anonymous opponent was some sort of admirer of Diemer, probably even a financier of Diemer in his later life, as this particular game was played in the 70s. Now, the game starts with the move d4, d5 by Diemer, and e4. So what audacity from his opponent to try and go into the opening that was co-created by him. Well, Diemer decides to take this pawn, as you should, knight to c3, and here Diemer probably plays what he thinks is the most interesting line against the blackmar-diemer, and it's probably worth knowing if you ever meet this particular setup with white. So the move e5, this is known as the Lemberger defense. So black immediately challenges the center and creates a few problems for white here. You know, if he ignores this threat, black is just going to go simply up a pawn here, and if he captures this pawn, this is no good for white at all, as now the queen can capture here, and really black doesn't want to take maybe so much of his king, as his king will no longer be able to castle. So knight takes on d1, and then the move knight to c6. Black has already got quite a nice position. If bishop to b5, now pinning this knight so it can't capture this pawn on e5, the move bishop to d7, and to be honest with you, I think black is doing absolutely fine here. He's going to be looking to castle long and have a really good edge in the position. So going back, a better line here maybe for white is to maybe capture with this knight here on e4, a little bit stronger, but black does still go down the pawn. However, I still think there's some chances for black to go wrong if he allows white's development to get too scary. So after e takes d4, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to d3, bishop g4. I think in this position black is probably doing fine here. He's been able to hold on to this pawn, and I think a simple plan is to maybe play the move queen to d7, castle long. And this pawn here is a bit of a thorn in white's side. It's got a lot of space in white's position. It's very difficult to dislodge. Black is already threatening to maybe take off this knight, which was one of the sole attackers against this pawn, and just hold on to this pawn for dear life. But going back, instead of all this, white plays another move, and it's probably the most ambitious try by white, as it is the main line in this position. The move queen to h5, and this is a very ambitious try by white, and sets up some nasty traps. So the first obvious trap for black here is if he tries to play the move g6 immediately. This is pretty bad, as now queen takes on e5. You've got this check, and you're threatening to capture this rook on h8. So probably not a good idea doing this. So instead, if let's say black were to capture this other pawn, he's now 2 pawns up, white can punish him for this greed with the move bishop to c4. You're now threatening to take on f7. Okay, queen to e7 can be played here, so holding on to this pawn here. But now bishop to g5 is interesting. You're now hitting the queen. You're trying to deflect it away from this square. If, let's say, knight to f6 is played, so creating a counter threat, and if white ignores this, then obviously what black should be able to easily start consolidating his position. So bishop takes on f6 is kind of forced. Queen takes on f6, and now after knight takes on e4, we have an interesting position as well. Black needs to stay onto this pawn, and white has managed to reclaim one of the pawns now. So if queen to e7, there's a very interesting line in this position that I think is worth noting, is the move castles long. And this is very interesting. As you'll see here, it looks as though white has just blundered his knight, but in actual fact is now just building up a very, very dangerous initiative against black here. So after queen takes on f7, king to d8, and the move knight to f3. This is a very interesting position and something worth knowing if you do ever go into this particular line. But going back, I don't think black was planning to play that in this position. In fact, Diemer against his move plays a very strong response. He plays the move knight to c6. This sets up a counter-attack against black here. Against white here. Now, moves like bishop to c4 don't work, as well. What's interesting about this knight move, it now defends this e5 square. So the move g6 can be played, and the queen, there's no threat of this queen taking and then doing all this sort of stuff. So this is absolutely fine for black. So going back in the game, the white pawn captured here. He can now do this because there's no longer this threat on d1, but Diemer plays the very nice strong counterattack knight to d4. He's threatening to come to c2, and there's not really a whole lot that white can do in this position. In actual fact, he has to only hold any sort of advantage in this position, he has to play the sad looking retreat queen to d1. It's now defending this pawn now, and after this, his opponent, Diemer, played bishop to g4, a very nice move, trying to deflect the queen away from this square. And, unfortunately, white goes for the bait. He now captures here on g4, and Diemer has a very nice finish here. He captures this pawn with check, and the king has only got one square it can go to. It can only go to e2, and now queen to d3. A very nice checkmate, a very nice quick miniature, and just shows what happens when you play the blackmar-diemer against Diemer himself. We now have another game. This again was against an anonymous opponent, between Anonymous versus Diemer. Now, Diemer plays an incredibly weird game in this one. In fact, he decides to play quite a lot of pawn moves, as we're about to see. So his opponent starts with knight to f3, and the move g5 is played. Already the first surprise of the game. This particular line, I believe, is called the Herstrom Gambit. It's perhaps not so good, but it's a very, very interesting line. So white gladly accepts the free pawn. Why not? e5 is played, so now the knight is under attack, and his opponent plays the best move in this position, the move d4. So simultaneously attacking in the centre, but also now defending his knight on g5. h6 is played, kicking the knight away. The knight goes back to f3, and now e4 is played. So he's played another pawn move to start chasing this knight. Now, interestingly enough, if instead of this, his opponent, after e4 goes back to f to d2, you get this quite interesting position. It looks a bit like a sort of reversed advanced French here. However, black is still down a pawn here. So going back, so after e4, the knight came to e5. d6, knight to c4, b5, so continuing this witch hunt on this poor knight. Knight comes to e3, d5, c4, trying to break up black's dominating looking pawn centre. B takes on c4, knight to c3 and c6, g3, and finally, after 10 moves, Diemer makes his first piece move with the move knight to e7. Okay, so what is going on in this position? Well, black has managed to at least somewhat get a good command of the centre with lots of pawns. White hasn't really been too useful in his moves that black has basically given him with all these pawn moves. He's got these two knights that, okay, are controlling the centre, but they're sort of biting, I guess, on granite a little bit against these pawns that are all protecting each other. His other pieces having a little bit of a difficult time to develop here. That's why I think he's played the move g3 to maybe get the bishop onto there, but I'm not too sure what the intentions are. I mean, was maybe white thinking about a move like f3 potentially, although that's going to weaken his king side somewhat. In any case, here we see a very odd move by his opponent, the move knight to g2. I really don't quite get this manoeuvre. I guess white was thinking about maybe coming to f4, but then you've got to think to yourself, what do you do about your bishop here? Because probably the bishop wants to also go to f4. So I don't really quite understand this move too much, and it's a bit of a silly place for this knight to be. Now Diemer plays f5 here. He further bolsters his centre. Bishop to f4. And now I think it's quite apparent how silly knight to g2 really looks. I mean, maybe it has to go off to h4, which isn't a great square for it to go to, or even just potentially come back to e3. I think maybe this was his idea. Of course, he's had to waste time doing that. Bishop to g7, f3 is played, and now Diemer plays quite a nasty looking fork here. He plays b6, so now hitting both this pawn and this pawn. f3 really is quite a poor move. I mean, okay, it does attack the pawn, but what is white hoping to achieve? If he takes, black just takes back, and you've just got a big gaping hole on your f-file. So anyway, queen to b6 is played, so now we have this nasty fork of these pawns. e3 is played to defend one of them, and now the queen comes crashing in onto b2. The rook comes to c1, trying to maybe defend this knight, but it's all a little bit too late for black, because now after e takes on f3, now threatening this knight. The knight, I guess, has to move, but where does it go to? Because, well, his opponent plays it to h4, but I think he missed this really, really nice move from black. Just the simple pawn to f2 checkmate. Quite a lovely checkmate, if you ask me. What else could have white done in this position? Well, there's not a whole lot more he could really do here. He could have maybe played the move rook to c2, stopping this threat, but the move f takes on g2 is really, really strong. The idea of this is obviously if this queen were to be captured, you can now promote in the corner of the board and you're still up materially. You've got your queen back and you've got a very, very nice position. Again, if maybe queen blocks instead, this is probably no good either, as you can maybe just capture here. The king captures, and then okay, you can just take on f on g2 and you're up materially here in this position as well. So I'll show you the last position just to show you the beauty of this checkmate. A pawn checkmate on f2. Somehow this pawn has made this very, well, long journey, shall we say, all the way up the board to then deliver checkmate against the king. So as I just mentioned just before those two miniatures, the beliefs and teachings of Nostradamus would end up dominating Diemer's life, even more so than chess. It was believed that he would go up to people on the street and shout and lament at them about the beliefs and teachings of Nostradamus. It was reported as well that he went to a funeral and shouted at the funeral that a living man is buried here. He also talked about how the river Rhine would run dry because of nuclear bombs that would fall on the city of Heidelberg. The authorities of the town in the province that he lived in dreaded, apparently, the ringing of the phone, fearing it would be Diemer again announcing the apocalypse. Because of these crazy outbursts by Emil Josef Diemer, in 1965 he ended up being admitted to a psychiatric clinic. The director of this particular clinic believed that for him to play chess was too much for Diemer's nerves, and he was actually told to stop playing the game. So 6 years we actually don't have any games at all on the database for Josef Diemer. I think there is though a couple of correspondence games on there, but otherwise there aren't many games at all on the database. However, in 1971 a young admirer brought to the cancellation of Diemer's admission to this particular clinic, and he would actually end up not only getting him out of the clinic but also getting rid of his expulsion from the German Chess Federation. This particular person was known as George Studier. He would actually end up being the biographer of Diemer, and he wanted Diemer to become a member of his German chess club because he believed him to be such a good player. He would make a brilliant first board player for his team. So Diemer was able to come back from being in a psychiatric clinic to then playing some amazing games, albeit much later on in his life. Despite the fact that he might have not been as strong as he probably was in the 50s, he still produced some amazing and extraordinary games later in his life. We're now going to look at this really nice miniature that Diemer played. This was in 1973, so he was already at this age about 65 years old, so much later in his prime, but it's still a brilliant game and a brilliant finish by Diemer. So the game started with his usual blackmar-diemer on the white side. We see this e4, d takes e4, knight to c3, knight to f6, f3, e takes f3, knight takes on f3, and bishop to f5. This is one of the lines against one of the main lines against the blackmar-diemer. This is known as the Tartakova variation. Black just gets on with his development and tries to at least nullify white's developmental advantage here. The downside of such a move is there is a strong line against this. It's the move knight to e5, and this actually has the idea, as you'll see after e6, of playing the move g4. So now immediately going after the bishop here. Now bishop comes back to g6 here, and now the move queen to f3. And you can start to see some of the problems for black here by playing this bishop out so early. It no longer defends this b7 square, which becomes a bit of a soft spot in black's position. c6 is played, which aims to try and blunt this queen on this diagonal, and the move g5 is played, trying to kick this knight away from potentially defending this f7 square. Knight to h5 is played, bishop to e3, getting on with development, knight to d7, and castles long. So both sides are just developing pretty normally here, pretty naturally, but white seems to have a bit more purpose with his development. He's getting his pieces to very good squares and starting to develop an attack along the centre. Well, I guess black here decided that white's development was getting a little bit uncomfortable here. He started to try and trade stuff off. After d takes an e5, now the rook is now challenging the queen. Queen to c7, now threatening this pawn. Bishop to g2. Diemer didn't care about his pawn on e5, but nonetheless the queen captures here on c6. Oh, sorry, on e5, sorry. And this is in fact a key mistake in this position, as I'm assuming black missed this wondrous continuation from Diemer, the move queen takes on c6, a queen sacrifice. What is going on in this position? Well, after b takes on c6, the bishop then captures on c6 with check, and then after king to e7, rook to d7, a brilliant move, king to e8, rook to d5 check, king comes back to e7 again, bishop to c5 check, queen tries to block it, so he actually gives back a queen here to try and stop the attack, but it's no use as the rook captures here, now going to be threatening another discovered attack here. f5 was played, trying to create some form of escape route for the king to get out, but it's too late, as rook to d7, king to e8, rook takes on a7 with check, another discovered attack with the bishop. Rook, king to d8, bishop to b6 check, king to c8, and finally rook takes on a8 checkmate. A beautiful checkmate combining the bishop pair along these lovely diagonals and this rook on the back rank. A very, very nice mate, and a beautiful combination from move 14. After this move here, we actually have a mate in 10 that Diemer manages to find over the board. In his late 60s and 70s, Diemer produced some wondrous attacking games, many of which that you've already seen in this documentary series. There are two games that are most famous, however, but they've already received a lot of coverage already. In 1973, Diemer played a game that is probably the most exciting draw in existence. This particular game was actually the inspiration for me to actually do this particular documentary in the first place. Sam Copeland has already provided some excellent analysis as part of his best games of the 1970s on his YouTube channel and blog channel. You can definitely check that out there, which will show you this amazing draw that occurred between these two very strong players. There's also a really amazing game that Diemer played in the 80s, which is a very interesting game because it involved 17 pawn moves by Diemer in his first 17 moves. This particular game, known as the Immortal Pawn Game or the Pawn Mower Game. Again, this particular game has received some excellent coverage on other channels, which I'll link below. But you can just see in this particular game, in 17 moves, Diemer playing 17 different pawn moves. Not a particularly great game analysis wise, as Diemer does make quite a few mistakes, but hilarious nonetheless. However, the last game that I wanted to show you in this documentary series is a game played by Diemer when he was 75 years old. This was in fact one of his last games that he played in the tournament, and just shows you that Diemer, even at this age, was still able to produce some amazing attacking masterpieces. His opponent doesn't play particularly well in this, I'll be honest with you, but it is the final game that features in his biographer's book on Diemer. He shows this particular game, and he actually doesn't provide any commentary on it, just simply because it is a very stunning attacking game. So once again, Diemer is on the black side this time round, and against this knight to f3 idea, he decides to go for this gambit line with g5. I didn't mention the first game that featured this particular gambit that we saw earlier in the video, that this is known as the Hirschstrom gambit. Not a particularly great gambit line, I'll be honest with you. Black is just giving up quite simply a pawn here in this position, but you know, it can be quite useful in blitz, and well, as you'll see here, Diemer uses this particular gambit effectively, although that being said, his opponent doesn't play perhaps the most testing line against it. So knight takes on g5, e5 is played, so now attacking the knight with the queen. d4 played, probably the best move again, so now defending this knight. h6, and here white makes the bold decision to take here on f7. It's probably about equal, this line, to be honest with you, with best play, as well, you know, materially speaking, black is going to go ahead here after king takes on f7, but his king is not the safest king at the moment. But Diemer is able to use his piece activity really well here and make his unsafe looking king not so much a target, whilst his opponent's king becomes a massive target in this position. So e4 is played. I'm guessing white wanted to try and create some attacks by opening up lines in the centre. But here Diemer plays a very nice move, queen to h4, which I really like, as this now is attacking this e4 pawn. But it's also, what's quite interesting here is it creates a potential escape square for this king to maybe run into if need be. So quite an interesting idea. Bishop to c4 check, but the king comes back to e8, so not really any danger here for black for the time being. Castle short here, which is probably slightly risky in this particular position, as well, all of black's pieces are kind of aiming a little bit down at some point against the white king here. d6 is played, a very nice move, opening up lines for the bishop. D takes on e5, knight to c6, so Diemer doesn't mind going down the pawn here, he's just going to get on with his development. g3 is played, the queen comes to g4, offering the exchange of queens. But to be honest with you, after the queen takes back and bishop takes back, in actual fact, black is not really that much better in this position. In fact, the material is quite even, but black has got superior development here. I think a simple line potentially is maybe moving this king up to maybe either d7 or coming to f8, and then getting the rooks onto this open file somehow. I think that's probably quite a nice line for black. And well, you know, white's still lagging a little bit in development here. So it's probably black who has got the advantage in that exchange. But in any case, f3 is played instead, and the queen comes to h3. E takes on d6, bishop takes on e6, and the move e5 is played. A bit of an odd move, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. White is just kind of giving up a pawn for nothing here. But I guess the idea for white was he was maybe trying to think about how to pin one of black's pieces against his king. So after the knight captures back here, rook to e1, I guess this had the idea of trying to pin some of black's pieces, but it didn't matter, as knight to e7 kind of stops those ideas in its tracks. Now this knight is no longer pinned, as this other knight now breaks the pin. Well, the bishop comes to b5, he tries to throw in this bit of a pointless check, to be honest with you. c6 is played, and well, the bishop ends up coming back to f1. I think white had maybe admitted that perhaps his attack had not gone so well, and he was trying to rush to the defence of his own king. Well, the queen comes back to h5, maintaining this pin against this queen, and the bishop comes to e2. There's a check, king comes to h1, and the other bishop now develops to e6. So black has nearly completed development, and he's also threatening to potentially come to d8, which is quite an annoying move to deal with, as white would need to actually self-pin with one of his pieces if he doesn't do anything about this. Well, the bishop comes to f4 here. Now the rook comes to d8, and really, as I say, this is a bit of an annoying threat for white. You know, he doesn't really want to have to make moves like queen to c1. You know, he has to kind of maybe put a knight in front here, which he does do, which now pins his knight. The rook captures here, a very powerful move, as now after bishop captures, the other bishop comes to d5, a very nice move. Notice how all of black's pieces are attacking this f-pawn. Well, the king rushes up to g2 to try and defend this position, but now rook to f8. Diemer piles another piece onto this pawn. The bishop comes to f4, trying to block the pathway of this rook, but now Diemer is able to demonstrate his amazing attacking prowess here. He captures this bishop anyway with his rook, an exchange sacrifice, but opens up the white king position. G takes on f4, queen to g4, a really nice move, exploiting the pin that has been created by this bishop. So this queen is totally impervious. And now the king comes to h1, and well, after knight takes on f3, in fact here his opponent resigns. There is nothing really that white can do in this position. He's either going to have to give up some significant material or get mated very, very quickly. I'll just show you one example line. If, let's say, this rook comes to g1, trying to block some of these threats, knight comes to e1 is crushing. There's no way to stop the number of mating threats by black. Notice how well his pieces are converging onto the white king. If, let's say, he blocks this check maybe with a bishop, then you throw in this checkmate. Let's say he tries to block it with the rook. Well, this is no good either. You could actually checkmate with the bishop here. Yeah, it's just not a good position. In fact, the engine is suggesting here just to take this bishop off of the queen. Definitely not a favourable trade here. And after c takes on d5, well, Diemer is just completely winning in this position. He's got a totally dominant position, he's up materially, and let's not forget the white king is still under attack in this position. And that brings us to the end of the life and games of Emil Josef Diemer. Thank you to everyone for your support in this particular documentary series. Thank you to everyone's likes and views. I hope you enjoyed this series as much as I enjoyed making it, although admittedly, I did take a little bit longer than I would have liked on this particular series to make. But if you did enjoy it, please make sure you leave a like, share this video if you haven't already, and if you haven't already, do make sure you do check out the other parts to this particular documentary series. I do make other YouTube videos which you can check on my channel, including some opening videos and some puzzle videos. So if you like what you see, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye bye.